Until midnight, this is Perth Tonight with Chris Ilsley on 882 6PR. The voice of Perth.
Yeah, we like to eat. It's apparently it's one of those weeks where they talk about Healthy Weight Week. We're joined on the program by Dr. Ali Dale from Shrinked, and I kind of think that Shrinked says it all, really. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Very well. Shrinked, well, that really says it all, doesn't it?
Well, it does. It's a bit of a play on words in terms of what we're wanting our body to do, but also that idea that we need to address the mind as well.
There's a lot of things we do that are, say, physical in nature, but also naturally have a mental component. If I were to ask you, in terms of maintaining a healthy weight, we know the physical stuff you can do, a la what you're putting in your mouth, etc. But how much of that is mental?
I think an enormous amount. So if you think, Chris, about what drives what you put in your mouth and what drives how much you move, at the end of the day, that's your brain. So it's the brain that drives us to make particular choices. So therefore, it's the control that we have over our brain that helps us determine whether we make really healthy choices or unhealthy choices.
I know you've carried out various different pieces of research, and look, to be honest, I don't want to get bogged down in numbers, but essentially we can agree that both genders are not happy with the way that they manage their diet.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If you're not happy with the way you do it, why wouldn't you do it differently?
Yeah, I guess that's the age-old question, isn't it? And it's really interesting because we know that over 60% of Australians are struggling with their weight. We know that over 70% of Australians are unhappy with the way that they're managing their diet if they're overweight. Now, the easy answer, I guess, is to tune into popular media and all the messages that just say, eat less, exercise more. We've been bombarded by that forever. And yet what we know, though, is that at the heart of our brains, one of our most primitive drivers is simply to eat. So if you think about thousands of years ago, if you think about cave days, there were precious things that we needed to worry about, and it was all about survival. It was all about the propagation of the species.
And the problem was when we were talking about those times, we had to catch the food, which in some cases was not too willing to be caught.
Absolutely. So we had to expend a whole heap of energy in order to get the food, and we had to survive times of feast and famine. Fast forward a few thousand years, we've got the same hard wiring. We're driven to eat, we're driven to conserve energy, and yet we live in a world where it's so easy for us to get very, very, very high-fat, high-energy type foods, and we haven't changed the way that we approach our relationship with it.
Well, actually, it's interesting you mentioned stuff about fat. Many experts are starting to say, well, fat's not the problem, it's sugar. And if that is indeed the case, then what's happened is for perhaps a couple of decades or more, people have been getting the wrong information.
Absolutely, and we're learning more all the time. So we certainly know now that sugar is something we need to be very mindful of, and particularly processed sugar. And again, your brain has a particular relationship with sugar, and so does your body. But we also know that very high saturated fat diets, the dietitians tell us still aren't good for you either. So we need to monitor our fat intake and reduce our sugar intake.
A lot of these things just seem to be practical advice, but there's no question that there's a lot of information out there that's conflicting. And a lot of information is conflicting from people who are arguably experts in their field. I'll put it to you this way. If the experts are confused, it leaves the rest of us in a fairly precarious position.
Yeah, and I understand, Chris, how it can seem that way. I think what the experts do agree on, though, is that we need a balanced diet, that we need probably all things in moderation, and that we need to move more. And more than that, though, we need to help people be able to make those choices. So to reduce the need for comfort eating and all those sorts of things, so that they can have a balanced diet.
Oh, and what about some of the other elephants in the room that nobody wishes to speak of, such as, for example, the food today may not be as nutritionally complete as the food was of yesterday. For example, tomatoes of today are not the same as tomatoes when I was a kid. I would absolutely swear that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some interesting research. And now this one isn't my area, but the doctors tell me that there's some very interesting research looking at what's happening in people's guts and the microbiomes as a result of the type of food that we're eating, and that the change in that environment is contributing to obesity. So again, we're learning more about it, and I don't think you're off the mark.
And what sort of role are things like preservatives playing? And the reason why I'm asking this question is because these things, if for example, we could take a clock and go back 50 years, the food that might be put on the table today may look the same as the food that was being put on the table 50 years ago, but in fact they're two separate things simply because of the very nature of what's in those foods.
So it would make sense that preservatives certainly have a role to play, but I guess what we also know, though, is we're consuming significantly more calories than we were 20 years ago. We know that our plate sizes have increased 22% in the last 11 years, and we fill to our plate sizes. So when we look at what we ate on average 20 years ago in terms of how energy dense it was much, much less energy dense than it is now, and we were moving more back then than we are now.
Can you indulge another one of my crackpot theories?
Yeah, I'd love to.
The possibility that, using that comparison, possibly the food that we were eating 20 years ago had a greater substance. So therefore, we felt fuller more quickly because what we were eating actually had more substance to it than it does now.
That is not such a crackpot theory. So there is a real reality to that. So we know when we look at proportionally what we ate in terms of the macronutrients that made up our plates, we were consuming higher fats and higher proteins and less sugar. And what we do know is that your body interacts with sugar in a very different way to how it interacts with other macronutrients. So we know that it doesn't fill you up for very long, and therefore you consume more of it. And more than that, that we know that your body stores it much, much more quickly into fat when you've had too much of it.
Is it also one of the problems you face the fact that nowadays we seem to have so many people giving us so many different messages about what we should and shouldn't do? Is there a certain amount of the people switch off and stop listening to the message factor?
Absolutely. And I guess what I would suggest is that it's time to change the message. So we've all given variations on the theme. So people have been told for years and years effectively, eat less, exercise more. So we know that message, and we might get magic new pills and we might get variations on that message. But what nobody is actually doing is changing the conversation and saying, okay, so what do we need to do? How can we help people put strategies in place to eat less and to move more and to focus on being healthy and well?
So what do we do in that regard?
So we know that there's a whole heap of strategies. So we know that, again, your brain responds in particular ways. So we know that if you get stressed, for example, that there's a whole heap of stress hormones that are released. We know that these stress hormones, they literally make you crave high energy foods, so carbohydrates or sugars, simple sugars in particular. Now we know that then once you consume those simple sugars, that it makes you feel better because it reduces those stress hormones. But we also know that any energy consumed in the presence of those stress hormones, much more likely to be stored as fat and stored as visceral fat in particular. So what we need to do is that's one of the conversations we need to start to have about teaching people really simple tricks to help manage their stress and the way their body responds to stress so that they can feel more in control and make some different choices.
How much of this is also attributed to social change that's taken place over the years? And one of the examples I go back to, once again, let's do the 50-year track. 50 years ago, generally speaking, you had the wife who was the homemaker, the husband who was the breadwinner, and one of the jobs and one of the functions that the wife performed was to prepare the meals in the household, which generally meant that the meals were prepared. You'd come home at night, kids, mum and dad, everyone would have what we would call a traditional home-cooked meal. There are some kids whose parents are so busy, and both parents working, and they're so busy that I would argue they would very rarely know what a true home-cooked meal is. And in some cases, they wouldn't know because they've really never had one.
Yeah, and again, there's so many contributors. So you're right, that absolutely is a contributor to what's going on. We know that the number of convenience foods that people are eating, and especially young children and adolescents in particular, we know that that's going through the roof. We know that concept of a family dinner where everyone sits down together and actually just eats. So they eat and they talk and they focus on eating. We know that has gone downhill dramatically, and we know that most people are eating in front of TVs or when they're doing other things. We know that when you eat when you're distracted, you eat significantly more because you don't feel full and you're usually eating convenience foods.
And you're also not focusing on what you're eating because eating is actually a very minor task relative to the other tasks that you're doing.
Absolutely. We've been eating forever, so it doesn't take any concentration for us to eat. So if we're not just focused on eating, we're focused on everything else, we have really limited attention. It means that we almost don't notice it for quite a while, and very quickly we'll eat to the point of being overfull. So we'll just keep eating. And again, that contributes.
Look, thanks very much for having a chat to us.
Chris, thanks so much for having me on.
Dr. Ali Dale is from Shrinked. Since we were talking about how much people eat and the size of people, do I really need to explain what Shrinked was all about?